Hello, and welcome to a deep exploration of the beautiful and enigmatic 1901 Pan American Exposition medals by Hermon Atkins MacNeil. My name is WhyteCross, and I'll be your guide on this journey. In addition to reviewing our current knowledge and understanding of these medals, this video series will also serve as an introduction to our new website devoted to these medals, panamcensus.com, with its census of each of the known medals still in existence, and an invitation to participate in the census for those who own examples of these medals or who know of examples of these medals. We'll start this series with a little background on the medals themselves, then we'll compare and contrast MacNeil's medals with the medals of two other giants of early 20th century American numismatic art and their respective World's Fairs medals, Augustus Saint-Gaudens in the 1892-1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, and Adolph Weinman's 1904 St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition. We'll then seek greater context for the mintages and surviving numbers of MacNeil's medals with another interesting and enigmatic release of 1901. Finally, we'll end this series with an overview of the current census of the surviving medals and an introduction to the website established for tracking and counting those existing medals, again, panamcensus.com. It's our hope that with the aid of the greater numismatic community, the website, and this new census, we'll finally be able to answer the overriding questions about the MacNeil medals. How many were made? How many still exist? And where are they now? Let's begin with a closer look at the medals themselves. I believe the 1901 Pan American Exposition Medal Awards by Hermon Atkins MacNeil, these are catalog Lavin TM103, Baxter 106, and Marcus E250, are the finest example of numismatic art from the pre-World War I era Beaux-Arts-inspired renaissance of American numismatics. The medals are approximately 64 millimeters in diameter, with a weight of approximately 92 grams. That goes for the gilded bronze that we see here and the bronze that we just examined a few moments ago. The silver of this series weighs considerably more at approximately 108.3 grams. By comparison, the Morgan dollar of the era, with a diameter of 38.1 millimeters and a weight of 26.73 grams. You can see that these medals are considerably larger than the largest circulating coin of this period. The medals share the same obverse and reverse designs across all three types, that is, gilt, silver, and bronze. The obverse depicts a female figure of liberty with an arm upheld, a billowing robe, and she's striding beside an American buffalo, whose meaning can be appreciated on many different levels, certainly strength and power, but it may also be kind of a nod to the final taming of the American frontier. It's also a symbol that is authentically and uniquely American, but it can also be taken just on the surface in an almost tongue-in-cheek humorous kind of way. The Pan American Exhibition, or the Pan as it became known by the people who attended, was held in Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, then one of the largest cities in America. The buffalo became kind of the unofficial mascot of the Pan, and it can be seen on many of the souvenirs from this period. The reverse of the medal features two First Nation warriors, the left representing Central and South America, the right representing North America, as you can see on the outlines of the continents on their respective shields. The shields, presumably with their weapons, are set aside, and the two figures are relaxed, comfortably discussing with one another, chatting with one another, with a peace pipe between them, gently smoking. I think that's a beautiful allegory and hope for peace between all of the nations of the American continents. I first encountered these medals about a decade ago, and it didn't take long for my interest to become a passion, and for that passion to become a quest to obtain examples for my own collection. But I quickly learned that examples are very hard to come by. Consequently, that quest also became a search for knowledge. How many of the Pan American medals were made? How many still exist, and where are they now? In order to best understand the MacNeil medals historically and numerically, I think it's advantageous to compare and contrast the medals of MacNeil with those of the two aforementioned and perhaps better-known giants of early 20th century American numismatics, Augustus Saint-Gaudens and Adolph Weinman. We'll look at these artists' respective medals in the context of the World's Fairs for which they were created, Saint-Gaudens for the Columbian Exposition of 1890-1893, MacNeil for the Pan American Exposition of 1901, and Weinman for the Louisiana Purchase of 1904. I think it's important to note just how closely spaced these were chronologically. This all happened within about a 12-year period of time. Why World's Fairs? World's Fairs have long been laboratories of American numismatics. The golden age of World's Fairs began in the 1850s, but the event that really established the connection between American numismatics and World's Fairs was probably the 1876 U.S. Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. That was America's first major multi-building World's Fair, which saw the release of several dozen medals in more than 150 different varieties. Those pieces became an early and major addition to the so-called dollar area of our hobby's exonumia branch, of which all of these medals before you belong. The golden age of Americans' World's Fairs lasted until about the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, with a few later exceptions. Wikipedia calls this earlier numismatically rich era of World's Fairs the industrialization era, followed in the late 1930s by the cultural exchange era, and finally the nation branding era. Hermon Atkins MacNeil was a well-known sculptor and artist towards the end of that first era. He is perhaps best known to our numismatic community for having designed the Standing Liberty Quarter 1916 to 1930. But MacNeil was also a sculptor who was fascinated with the rapidly disappearing Native American, indigenous, or First Nations cultures that had been found within the borders of our country. And as I indicated earlier, MacNeil wasn't the only American coin designer to create World's Fair medals during this period. As we'll see, these giants and other familiar names of American numismatics often crossed paths, sometimes collaborated, and occasionally even fought and competed against each other with the World's Fairs as the backdrop. Augustus Saint-Gaudens notoriously fought with U.S. Mint chief engraver Charles Barber about their 1892, minted 1896, Chicago Columbian Exposition medal. This is catalog LJIT 19 HK223. Saint-Gaudens' controversial original reverse featured a Greco-Roman influenced nude male youth, and that design was eventually rejected and replaced by the design of Charles Barber. I think this is a great example of the contrast between the older, somewhat sterile or even lifeless designs of the previous generation of American designers, which included Barber, Morgan, and Longacre, and this new wave of American numismatic designers, which included artists like Saint-Gaudens, MacNeil, Victor David Brenner, Fraser, Adolph Weinman. This sea change in the style of American coinage and numismatic design showed the humanity of the subjects, maybe even the soul of their subjects, not just the skill and execution. Interestingly, the controversy of Saint-Gaudens' reverse design would be in some ways mirrored by MacNeil's own design controversy in 1916 with release of the Standing Liberty Quarter. Adolph Weinman, of course, designer of the Walking Liberty half dollar and the Winged Liberty or Mercury dime, also designed the four 1904 St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition medals, which incidentally were approved by a committee that included Augustus Saint-Gaudens. Another of this new school of numismatic designers was James Earl Fraser. Fraser would go on to create a more famous numismatic work with a First Nation warrior on one side and a buffalo on the other that was undoubtedly inspired by the earlier medal, according to American Numismatic Society chief curator Peter Van Alphen. He was, of course, referring to the MacNeil 1901 Pan American medals. Fraser designed a special medal of honor for his mentor to present at the 1901 Pan American Exposition. His mentor was Augustus Saint-Gaudens. Fraser then went on to win gold awards for the sculptures that he exhibited at the 1904 St. Louis Exposition. Similarly, Hermon Atkins MacNeil won the gold medal that he designed for the 1901 Pan American Exposition for the sculptures that he exhibited at the Pan. So again, I think you can see the intertwined interconnectedness of these giants of American numismatics in the context of these medals and the World's Fairs for which they were created. The Saint-Gaudens and Weinman Exposition medals are all very good. I think elements of them are even great, but it's my opinion that MacNeil's designs rise to a level that neither Saint-Gaudens nor Weinman achieved, MacNeil has in fact been called the first truly American sculptor. Numismatic author Barbara Baxter says of MacNeil, quote, "It's clear the sculptor intended to produce a design that would be unmistakably American. And I feel it's this decidedly American subject matter and even execution that is part of what sets MacNeil's medals apart. But there's also an air of mystery surrounding these medals. The tragedy of President McKinley's assassination at the Pan understandably took the wind out of the sails of the nation and the fair, which ended somewhat chaotically about 6 weeks later. So the exact mintage of the medals remains somewhat in doubt. Again, how many of the Pan American medals were made? How many survive, and where are they? One official medal count from a contemporary St. Louis newspaper article that is accessible through the National Archives puts that total medal count at just 3,193. That's a figure we will revisit many times. And that figure, if accurate, is quite small for any 20th century numismatic release, but as we'll see by comparison, the maximum number of 3,193 is shockingly small compared to its contemporaries. The Buffalo Morning Express newspaper article from October 10th, 1901 seems to confirm that medal count and also includes a full list of winners in every category and every medal. This article details just how specific and well-regulated the competition was for the Pan American Exposition. I think this is an important thing to note, especially how specific the juries and the exhibitors were taking the competition here and how those winners were eventually selected. The winners were selected from 7,000 exhibits, which the aforementioned article said, quote, included an almost endless variety of objects, ranging from the simplest products of the soil and of the mind to the most delicate machinery and the most recent results of science and art. The exhibits were divided into 17 divisions, mostly housed within their respective buildings at the Pan. Those divisions were further separated into 139 groups, which were then subdivided into 580 classes. The individual exhibits within those classes were judged by a jury of experts numbering 150 in all, whose recommendations were then reviewed and approved by a superior jury made up of the Superintendent of Awards, the Secretary of the Board of Awards, the Superintendent of the exhibit divisions, and the Chairman of the division juries in their respective fields. Their findings presented finally and without appeal the order of merit for the awards. 4 classes of awards were offered to the exhibitors, and I think the terminology used here is important as well, namely diplomas of gold medals, diplomas of silver medals, diplomas of bronze medals, and diplomas of honorable mention. In total, 3,193 diplomas were awarded, 887 gold, 1,159 in silver, 1,147 in bronze. There are 3 important points to note here. The first is the strict manner in which the exhibitors competed for medals and how seriously their exhibits were judged. The second is the use of the word diploma, and that's a point that we will return to shortly. The third point to note is that this was the Pan American Exposition, so the medals were distributed to exhibitors from 20 different countries in North America, Central America, South America, and even the Caribbean. The records indicate, not surprisingly, that the United States led the final medal count with 1,826 total, 601 gold, 663 silver, 562 bronze medals. I think that distribution is also somewhat interesting. They are very close to each other. NGC reports that some of the silver medals are actually silvered bronze, and while we're at it, there are also 2 solid gold medals that we know of so far, the Eldridge R. Johnson and the Campana Cigarrera Mexicana medals. We will take a look at those medals later. So where are these roughly 600 medals issued to American winners? A perusal of auction sites often yields few, if any, MacNeil medals. By comparison, the St. Gaudens Columbian Exposition medals are relatively plentiful, inexpensive, and easy to find, but the St. Gaudens medals were awarded in a different manner and to an entirely different population than the Pan American medals. Rather than gilt, silver, and bronze given to the top exhibits in their respective fields, the Columbian Exposition applied a point scale. All exhibitors earning above that point threshold received a medal. So they weren't so much competing against each other, rather they just needed to check off enough boxes to qualify for a medal. The result, a mintage of 23,597 pieces. Not only was that initial mintage much greater, but there were also no tiers of metals. All of them were bronze. There was no gold or gilt or silver. And that may factor into the perceived abundance of the Columbian Exposition metals compared to the Pan American. Another side note, there are a few gilt and partial gilt examples of the Columbian Exposition metals known. PCGS also reports proof gilt and even aluminum versions, but clearly the vast majority of these are the standard bronze version. The 4 medals designed by Weinman for the 1904 St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition were issued collectively and even individually in greater numbers than the entire reported Pan American run. 3,300 grand prize, that is catalog Baxter 109, Marquessy 390. 9,000 gold, of which this is an example, Baxter 108, Marquessy 391. 11,550 silver, that is Baxter 110, Marquessy 392, 10,000 bronze, Baxter 111, Marquessy 393, and even 6,000 commemorative medals. There were another 2,400 grand gold, silver, and bronze medals issued just for the Philippine exhibit, so bookended between the 1893 Columbian Exposition with 23,597 medals and a combined 39,850 medals issued for the 1904 St. Louis Exposition. The reported maximum mintage for the Pan American at 3193 seems remarkably small. These figures underscore just how small the number of medals created for the Pan were by comparison, but when discussing the subject with collectors and dealers, the consensus always seems to be that the number of surviving medals is even significantly smaller than these comparative numbers might suggest. A 2010 video by the American Association of Young Numismatists suggests the silver medals are, quote, by far the rarest of the trio. By the trio, they mean gilt, silver, and bronze, and offers, quote, there are probably about 20 silver pieces that remain. An excellent online resource for medals and medal collectors, medallicartcollector.org, gives the following possibility. The silver variants are very rare, but no mintages have been reported. I think if you consider the auction listings and marketing copy from the intermittent sale of these medals, you can see that they tend to echo this belief and seem to suggest that each of these medals is likely R5 on the Sheldon rarity scale, that is, 31 to 75 existing examples, but possibly even R6, that is 13 to 30 known examples still in existence. Medallic art collectors' observations suggest one explanation for the missing pieces. Awarded may not have equaled minted. We do have a few examples of the ornate diplomas mentioned earlier still in existence. The Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts has one such certificate in their archives for a gold medal awarded to artist Thomas Eakins. But unfortunately, the existence of these paper diplomas doesn't prove or disprove a definitive relationship between them and the physical medals. So what could cause the disparity? Perhaps exhibitors packed up and left before the riotous end of the fair on the notorious Buffalo Day, which author Mark Goldman said, quote, began in failure and ended in mayhem. It's also possible that the dark clouds of the McKinley assassination made exhibitors want to leave the Pan and put all of their experiences behind them. Larger businesses or exhibitors from other countries may have been more interested in the publicity available to them for having exhibited in one than having a small physical token of that win. In fact, contemporary ads from this period do showcase Pan American medals, but they are often blank medals with no name and exurg from a generic printer block. There may have been a cumbersome or lengthy process for applying for and receiving the medals. The prospect of international mail certainly at the turn of the 20th century could have been a factor. The exposition itself, originally slated to begin in 1899, was delayed by the Spanish-American War, which occurred about a year earlier, so perhaps the tumultuous timing and memories of the fresh conflict contributed in some way. While all of this is just speculation, the aforementioned Columbian Exposition medals weren't struck until 3 years after that exposition closed, and even Fraser's Medal of Honor for St. Gaudens wasn't completed until after St. Gaudens' death 6 years later. A less hopeful possibility and an explanation for the apparent scarcity of these medals could be that the medals were fodders for the various medal drives during the first two world wars. As the 1943 steel cents testify, bronze, presumably including gilded bronze, was an urgently needed material for munitions. In truth, a medal awarded in 1901 was probably not that important by the time the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, was probably even less so by the time we entered World War II in 1943. The silver medal, which again weighed about 108 grams, or the equivalent of about 4 U.S. silver dollars, could have put food on the table during the Great Depression. However, if these unfortunate scenarios are true for the MacNeil medals, so should they be true for the Saint-Gaudens and Weinman medals. But remember, with mintages in the tens of thousands, these medals from the two other fairs could have withstood losses of 80% or even more, and their survivors would still outnumber that entire maximum possible reported mintage of 3193 for the Pan American medals. Of course, it's possible that the MacNeil medals were all minted and were all distributed, and it's possible that they are all still out there, tucked away as family heirlooms, in corporate safes, strong collector hands, or even museum archives. Surely some of them fall into these categories, and we'll see some of those later in this series. But whether treasured or completely forgotten, the result is the same. They are not a visible part of our community or the marketplace, so they remain unseen and uncounted. This ends part one of this two-part series on the 1901 Pan American medals of Hermon Atkins MacNeil. In part two of this series, we'll compare their original mintage and the surviving numbers with another unusual, enigmatic, and sought-after medal of 1901, whose survivors are also now being cataloged. That is the Lesher Referendum dollars. And we'll begin the journey of searching for and counting the surviving examples of the MacNeil medals leading up to the numbers as we know them to stand today. Thank you for joining us for part one of this series. I hope we will see you back here for part two.